The nose of Britain's Pitt family has a curious history. One can watch its transmigrations through 3 lives. The tremendous hook of old Lord Chatham, under whose curve empires came to birth, was succeeded by the bleak, upward-pointing nose of William Pitt the Younger, the rigid symbol of an indomitable hauteur. With Lady Hester Stanhope came the final stage. The nose, still with an upward tilt in it, had lost its masculinity. The hard bones of the uncle and the grandfather had disappeared. Lady Hester's was a nose of wild ambitions, of pride grown fantastical, a nose that scorned the earth, shooting off, one fancies, towards some eternally eccentric heaven. It was a nose, in fact, altogether in the air. Noses, of course, are aristocratic things, and Lady Hester was the child of a great aristocracy. But, in her case, the aristocratic impulse, which had carried her predecessors to glory, had less fortunate results. There has always been a strong strain of extravagance in the governing families of England. From time to time they throw off some peculiarly ill-balanced member who performs a strange meteoric course. She was born in 1776, the eldest daughter of that extraordinary Earl Stanhope, Jacobin and inventor, who made the first steamboat and the first calculating machine, who defended the French Revolution in the House of Lords, and erased the armorial bearings from his carriages and his plate. Her mother, Chatham's daughter, and the favourite sister of Pitt, died when she was 4 years old. The second Lady Stanhope, a frigid woman of fashion, left her stepdaughters to the care of futile governesses, while Citizen Stanhope ruled the household from his laboratory with the violence of a tyrant. It was not until Lady Hester was 24 that she escaped from the slavery of her father's house by going to live with her grandmother, Lady Chatham. On Lady Chatham's death 3 years later, Pitt offered her his protection, and she remained with him until his death in 1806. Her 3 years with Pitt, passed in the very centre of splendid power, were brilliant and exciting. She flung herself impetuously into the movement and the passion of that vigorous society. She ruled her uncle's household with high vivacity. She was liked and courted. If not beautiful, she was fascinating. Very tall, with a very fair and clear complexion and dark blue eyes, and a countenance of wonderful expressiveness. She was devoted to her uncle, who warmly returned her affection. She was devoted, but in a more dangerous fashion, to the intoxicating Lord Granville Leveson Gower. The reckless manner in which she carried on this love affair was the first indication of something overstrained, something wild and unaccountable in her temperament. Lord Granville, after flirting with her outrageously, declared that he could never marry her, and went off on an embassy to St. Petersburg. Her distraction was extreme. She hinted that she would follow him to Russia. She threatened and perhaps attempted suicide. She went about telling everybody that he had jilted her. In the midst of these excursions and alarums, there was a terrible and unexpected catastrophe. Pitt died, and Lady Hester suddenly found herself a dethroned princess, living in a small house in Montague Square, on a pension of £1,200 a year. She did not abandon society, and the tongue of gossip continued to wag. Her immediate marriage with a former lover, Mr. Hill, was announced. "Il est bien bon," said Lady Bessborough. Then it was whispered that Privy Councillor Stratford Canning was with her, not only all day but almost all night. She quarrelled with Canning and became attached to Sir John Moore. Whether she was actually engaged to marry him is doubtful, but it is certain that he died with her name on his lips. Her favourite brother, Charles, was killed beside him, and it was natural that under this double blow she should have retired from London. She buried herself in Wales, but not for long. In 1810 she set sail for Gibraltar with her brother James, who was rejoining his regiment in the peninsula. She never returned to England. There can be no doubt that at the time of her departure, the thought of a lifelong exile was far from her mind. It was only gradually, as she moved further and further eastward, that the prospect of life in England, and at last even in Europe, grew distasteful to her. After spending many months in Constantinople, Lady Hester discovered that she was dying to see Napoleon with her own eyes, and attempted accordingly to obtain passports to France. The project was stopped by Canning, upon which she decided to visit Egypt, and chartering a Greek vessel, sailed for Alexandria in the winter of 1811. Off the island of Rhodes, a violent storm sprang up. The whole party were forced to abandon the ship and to take refuge upon a bare rock, where they remained without food or shelter for 30 hours. Eventually, Alexandria was reached in safety, but this disastrous voyage was a turning point in Lady Hester's career. At Rhodes, she was forced to exchange her torn and dripping raiment for the attire of a Turkish gentleman, a dress which she never afterwards abandoned. It was the first step in her orientalization. She passed the next 2 years in a triumphal progress. Her appearance in Cairo caused the greatest sensation, and she was received in state by the Pasha, Mehmet Ali. Her costume on this occasion was gorgeous. She wore a turban of cashmere, a brocaded waistcoat, a priceless pelisse, and a vast pair of purple velvet pantaloons embroidered all over in gold. She was ushered by chamberlains with silver wands through the inner courts of the palace to a pavilion in the harem, where the Pasha, rising to receive her, conversed with her for an hour. From Cairo, she turned northwards, visiting Jaffa, Jerusalem, Acre, and Damascus. Her traveling dress was of scarlet cloth trimmed with gold, and when on horseback, she wore over the whole a white hooded and tasseled burnous. Her maid, too, was forced, protesting, into trousers, though she absolutely refused to ride astride. Outside Damascus, Lady Hester was warned that the town was the most fanatical in Turkey, and that the scandal of a woman entering it in man's clothes unveiled would be so great as to be dangerous. She was begged to veil herself and to make her entry under cover of darkness. "I must take the bull by the horns," she replied, and rode into the city unveiled at midday. The population were thunderstruck, but at last their amazement gave way to enthusiasm, and the incredible lady was hailed everywhere as Queen. Crowds followed her, coffee was poured out before her, and the whole bazaar rose as she passed. Yet she was not satisfied with her triumphs. She would do something still more glorious and astonishing. She would plunge into the desert and visit the ruins of Palmyra, which only half a dozen of the boldest travelers had ever seen. The Pasha of Damascus offered her a military escort, but she preferred to throw herself upon the hospitality of the Bedouin Arabs, who, overcome by her horsemanship, her powers of sight, and her courage, enrolled her a member of their tribe. After a week's journey in their company, she reached Palmyra, where the inhabitants met her with wild enthusiasm and, under the Corinthian columns of Zenobia's temple, crowned her head with flowers. This happened in March 1813. It was the apogee of Lady Hester's life. Henceforward, her fortunes gradually but steadily declined. The rumor of her exploits had spread through Syria, and from the year 1813 onwards, her reputation was enormous. She was received everywhere as a royal, almost as a supernatural personage. She progressed from town to town amid official prostrations and popular rejoicings, but she herself was in a state of hesitation and discontent. Her future was uncertain. She had grown scornful of the West. Must she return to it? At Laodicea, she was suddenly struck down by the plague, and after months of illness, it was borne in upon her that all was vanity. She rented an empty monastery on the slopes of Mount Lebanon, not far from the ancient Sidon, and took up her abode there. Then her mind took a new surprising turn. She dashed to Ascalon and, with the permission of the Sultan, began excavations in a ruined temple with the object of discovering a hidden treasure of 3 million pieces of gold. Having unearthed nothing but an antique statue, which, in order to prove her disinterestedness, she ordered her appalled doctor to break into little bits, she returned to her monastery. Finally, in 1816, she moved to another house further up Mount Lebanon and near the village of June, and at June she remained until her death, more than 20 years later. Thus, almost accidentally as it seems, she came to the end of her wanderings, and the last, long, strange, mythical period of her existence began. Certainly, the situation that she had chosen was sublime. Her house, on the top of a high bare hill among great mountains, was a one-storied group of buildings, with many ramifying courts and outhouses, and a garden of several acres surrounded by a rampart wall. The garden, which she herself had planted and tended with the utmost care, commanded a glorious prospect. On every side but one, the vast mountains towered, but to the west there was an opening, through which, in the far distance, the deep blue Mediterranean was revealed. From this romantic hermitage, her singular renown spread over the world. European travelers who had been admitted to her presence brought back stories full of Eastern mystery. They told of a peculiar grandeur, a marvelous prestige, an imperial power. The precise nature of Lady Hester's empire was indeed dubious. She was in fact merely the tenant of her June establishment, for which she paid a rent of £20 a year. But her dominion was not subject to such limitations. She ruled imaginatively, transcendentally. The solid glory of Chatham had been transmuted into the fantasy of an Arabian night. She plunged into astrology and divination. She awaited the moment when, in accordance with prophecy, she should enter Jerusalem side by side with the Mahdi. She kept 2 sacred horses, destined by sure signs to carry her and him to their last triumph. The Orient had mastered her utterly. She was no longer an Englishwoman, she declared. She loathed England. She would never go there again, and if she went anywhere, it would be to Arabia, to her own people. Her expenses were immense, not only for herself but for others, for she poured out her hospitality with a noble hand. She ran into debt and was swindled by the moneylenders. Her steward cheated her. Her servants pilfered her. Her distress was at last acute. She fell into fits of terrible depression, bursting into dreadful tears and savage cries. Her habits grew more and more eccentric. She lay in bed all day and sat up all night, talking unceasingly for hour upon hour to Dr. Merion, who alone of her English attendants remained with her. The doctor was a poor-spirited and muddle-headed man, but he was a good listener, and there he sat while that extraordinary talk flowed on, talk that scaled the heavens and ransacked the earth, talk in which memories of an abolished past. She might be robbed and ruined, her house might crumble over her head, but she talked on. She grew ill and desperate, yet still she talked. Her melancholy deepened into a settled gloom when the news came of her brother James' death. She had quarrelled with all her English friends, with her eldest brother, with her sister, whose kind letters she left unanswered. She was at daggers, drawn with the English consul at Alexandria, who worried her about her debts. Ill and harassed, she hardly moved from her bedroom, while her servants rifled her belongings and reduced the house to a condition of indescribable disorder and filth. 36 hungry cats ranged through the rooms, filling the courts with frightful noises. Dr. Merion, in the midst of it all, knew not whether to cry or laugh. At moments, the great lady regained her ancient fire. Her bells pealed tumultuously for hours together, or she leapt up and arraigned the whole trembling household before her, with her Arab war mace in her hand. The final blow fell when a letter came from the English authorities threatening to cut off her pension for the payment of her debts. Upon that, after dispatching a series of furious missives to Lord Palmerston, to Queen Victoria, to the Duke of Wellington, she renounced the world. She commanded Dr. Merion to return to Europe, and he obeyed her. Her health was broken, she was over 60, and save for her vile servants, absolutely alone. She lived for nearly a year after he left her. We know no more. The end came in June 1839. Her servants immediately possessed themselves of every movable object in the house. But Lady Hester cared no longer. She was lying back in her bed, inexplicable, grand, preposterous, with her nose in the air.